Thank you, Sam. Now, this is a joint presentation, the final paper, Maitrayee Mukherjee and Alekhya Mandal, who both of them are associated with ILSR British Library EAP project right now. And the title of their paper is Colonialism and the Nomadic Self, Revisiting the Critical Thoughts of Anagarika Dhammapala and the Mohamedi Movement. So, would you like to deliver first? Okay, over to you, Maitrayee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I go directly to my paper due to the time constraints. Theories of criticism often are restricted within an academic domain only without advocating its role of turning the theoretical understanding into practical implementations. The etymology of the term theory refers back to the Greek theoros, which means spectator. The development of theory thus heavily relies on the relationship between a spectator and the event or the participants in that event, the process of mediation within the spectator, and most importantly, the choice of the spectator to observe a certain event in a certain way. Thus, it is the event, its context, participants, and the spectator who indulges in an observatory or preferably dialogic interaction to develop a theory. And hence, theories, especially critical theories, hold the responsibility of practical implementation to remain aligned with the process of its origin, and otherwise hold the risk of being completely disassociated from the essential factors contributing to the birth of it. Keeping this in mind, this paper attempts to understand the life and thoughts of Anagarika Dharmapala, a Buddhist whose voice reached the world religion parliament, yet often forgotten, misunderstood, or disregarded in his contemporary and afterwards broader discussion of religious alternatives, construction of nationalism and universalism, and in the post-colonial approach of criticism. The first section of this paper will focus on the book entitled Rescued from the Nation, Anagarika Dharmapala and the Buddhist World by Stephen Kemper, and evaluate the authorial voice of the writer in the context of the Dharmapala debate. The second section, which will be read by Alekhya, will attempt to understand how the nomadic self of Dharmapala was self-deconstructed by him, and how modernist Buddhism connects to this very trend. The deconstructionist approach has often been criticized for its inability to provide a contextual, political, and implementable solution. Jeffrey Nilon quotes in his publication, by neglecting the pragmatic and historical context of utterance of what is dramatized in such a manner as to cancel it out, the criticism in question reveals its origins in romantic as well as in a certain interpretation idealist philosophy. It is a supra-historical criticism that pretends to speak from a position free of ideology, that is, from an absolute point of view. This allegation of decontextualization, gradual neutralization, and therefore being a supra-historical criticism, has been associated with the deconstructionist approach for a long time in the American context. The idea of speaking from a position free of ideology, or rather the very existence of an absolute perspective of the spectator while developing a theory, can be problematized. The disassociation from the practicality holds the risk of depoliticization, and the deconstructionist approach, or at least parts of it, can be understood as denying the established meaning of discourses or signifiers and recognizing how they cancel themselves out within a text. It can be feared that the passive declaration of signifiers cancelling each other out results in a reactionary and nihilistic textual undecidability, if the practice of the deconstructionist approach is kept limited within this part only. Thus, it is the fundamental responsibility bestowed upon critical theory from the time and process of development that claims deconstruction to have further roles and actions. As Derrida mentions, I quote, "The word deconstruction, like all other words, acquires its value only from its inscription in a chain of possible substitutions in what is too widely called a context. For me, for what I have tried and still try to write, the word only has an interest within a certain context where it replaces and lets itself be determined by such other words as margin, etc. Unquote. The retention of the context or margin in the deconstructionist approach is possible when the theoretical understanding or the process of deconstruction produces certain breach or intervention, if not subversion, in an established system of binaries. It is not the neutralization that marks the goal of the deconstructionist criticism, but rather the complete change of the mediation, the thought process, and therefore the choice of the spectator to cross borders. The second section of the theoretical approach becomes extremely relevant in discussing Dharmapala or positioning him in the colonial struggle of Sri Lanka as a nation, Sinhalese as a race against the empire, or the development of a Buddhist universalism with the intention of inclusion and world religioning of Buddhism. Dharmapala was born as an upper-class Sinhalese in 1864 to one of the richest merchants of Ceylon at that time named Don Carolis Heavitharana. His change of name to Anagarika Dharmapala after ordination is to be noted. Dharmapala refers to the one who protects the dharma or the way of life, and Anagarika means homeless. He shaped his life as a theosophist and saw himself as a citizen of the world simultaneously of Sri Lanka, thus constantly redefining and repositioning the idea of home, connecting it to religious faith and practices. And according to the narrative that Kempers provides in his book, Dharmapala actually literally turned the world through traveling into his home rather than being grounded to Sri Lanka and his community only. The writings and dialogues of Dharmapala reveal his goal towards Buddhist universalism, considering himself a citizen of world on other hand, and on the other, his fight for Bodh Gaya, and marking it as the home ground of universalized Buddhism creates a philosophical and action paradox. Dharmapala was a subject of the colony, and it seemed essential to him to establish a stronghold, which can be read as a center even for the world religioning of Buddhism. Tomoko Masuzawa defines the notion of world religion as a discursive formation by which religions were commensurate. When the colonial agenda supported the missionary expansion of Christianism globally, the idea of equalization for all religions was drafted in a Christian matrix, and it can be easily inferred that for Buddhism, the same would happen in another context of a different particular. Masuzawa comments that the world religion attempts to turn material practices into timeless and supra-historical expressions, thus depoliticizing them. Dharmapala escaped this risk of depoliticization through Buddha Bodh Gaya movement, but however dicey his positions may be among critics, he remained political, if not polarized, in all his endeavors. This can be recognized as a breach of the process of religious colonization offered by the legacy of Christianism and turning toward universalism with at least the intention of inclusiveness. At points, he disassociated from his identity as a Sinhalese man and avoided the hierarchy already at work in global sociopolitics. He created an extremely prominent example of deconstruction without depoliticization and constant conflicts within the individual self. Such fractured and liminal conditions of individualism, nationalism, and universalism, their intersections and relentless conflict, stood in opposition to the theosophic utopia preached and visioned by Dharmapala in his private life. Dharmapala defamiliarized binaries in his private self, ways of life, and his public presence and preachings, creating multiple conflicting factors that are paradoxical and nullify each other. However, I cannot explain all of the sides in his life where he tried to implement this deconstructionist approach due to the time constraint. But I can say that for Dharmapala, the ways of life, the life he lived, the ways of celibacy, or in his theosophic thoughts and everything, it was more of the non-presence of a presence. He considered the non-presence of anything, the non-presence of politics in theosophy, in activism in theosophy, or the non-presence of samsara, or the life of the ordinary, as the presence of something. So for him, it was not a sacrifice. And now I hand over the mic to Alekhya.
Thank you. Within the South Asian context, particularly in India and Sri Lanka, Buddhism had undergone several institutional and organizational changes throughout the 19th and 20th century, more often local, but integrating these local changes to a national and even universal worldview. Rather than presenting itself as a meek witness to the socio-political, spatio-temporal changes, it often presented itself as a part of it, aspiring itself to be the thriving factor of the changes. One of the important aspects of the form and method of Hindu 19th century Buddhism is the assimilation as well as syncretism of ideas such as scienticism, epistemic uncertainty, global citizenry within the discourse without aiming for a prescriptive monolithic end. In this arena, termed variously by historian, anthropologists, and sociologists as modern Buddhism, Buddhist modernity, or even Buddhist modernisms, Anagarika Dharmapala is pronounced along with a series of Buddhist reformer revivalists such as Daisetsu Suzuki and Hikaduve Sumangala, and probably also along with social reformer politicians such as S.W. Ardhi Bandanaike and Babasaheb Ambedkar. A vast array of scholars, even in their recently published works, has more often than not surrendered themselves to the temptation of categorizing him without recognizing his protean life as well as afterlife. The paradoxical nature of this dynamism is that it accepts as well as rejects scholarly commentary. The nature of this impasse is such that one cannot have a bird's eye view towards the body of Dharmapala criticism without comparing the individual as a Derridean iconoclast, an exemplification of the nomadic self. The paradoxical nature is summed up by Stephen Kemper in his most recent monograph. However central to his goals a united Buddhist world may have been, Dharmapala's relationship to Buddhism was itself scarcely unitary. He cites multiple incidents, one of the most important ones being his speech at the 7th Hindu Mahasabha, and Kempa writes about it. In Western settings, Dharmapala presented a westernized Buddhism. He traveled along with a Bible, which he employed as a reference tool. His education in a variety of missionary schools had given him the knowledge of Christianity at least equal to what he knew of Buddhism before he turned his mind to own religion. The complicated aspect of this worldview is understandable by the fact that Dharmapala argued against both of these strands at other points in his life. In more than a single occasion, Dharmapala accused the colonial race of hybridizing their customs and their religion and chastised the Sri Lankans who in ways imitated with the British. Further, his points of conflict with the universalists, as Swami Vivekananda rests on his accusation that they have merely used Buddhism to strengthen his own agenda without contributing to it. This is further complicated by the fact that Dharmapala was expressing his opinion at Hindu Mahasabha, which even at the time was a prominent right-wing Hindu nationalist outfit. Even though Stephen Kemper cursorily mentions this incident, possibly because this idea is somewhat antithetical to his thesis, it prominently forms the basis of a chapter 4 of Douglas Ober's very recently published monograph. He notes, quote, "The urgency and seriousness with which the modern Indian thinkers dwell on these matters, however, cannot be solely reduced to wider intellectual apparatus of colonial modernity and its attempt to make sense of a vast history through new umbrella concepts like Hinduism and Buddhism. The issue of the Buddha's Hinduness was also driven forward by the politics of the moment. There were domestic concerns, the rising tide of internationalism, transnational religious networks, and the desire, perhaps even need, to craft a space, a home, for India in an Asia that was so often imagined in a Buddhist guise. The politics of the moment, as stated above, therefore creates an auto deconstruction, as instead of forming a solidifying pattern on which such ideas can be deconstructed, the discourses propounded by Dharmapala has a melting vision. To analyze the disintegrated structure of Dharmapala, Kempa states that Dharmapala presented a distinctive Buddhism for every constituency. What Barman states is very important here. The world stage on which they were supposed to play their part has disintegrated and metamorphosed into something unrecognizable, surreal, a mobile construction that shifts and changes shape under the player's feet. In this way, Dharmapala transitions his own Buddhism to achieve a global modernity. However, this modernity was borrowed from colonial discourses is a lengthy question to answer. I will not go into the details, but I can say that his source of learning Buddhist doctrines remains to be the formerly Protestant theosophist Henry Steele Olcott. And Dharmapala was well aware of the importance of media in his times, prompting him to start Sinhala Buddhaya using a second-hand printing press that he brought from Christian missionaries. He often boasted his knowledge of Bible and admitted that such knowledge has helped him to reinterpret Christianity in his own terms. Most importantly, this modernity has also allowed him to pursue his nationalist agenda, one which is based on the reversal of discourses portraying Europeans as savages and Sinhalas as descendants of a glorious race. It should be easy to conclude, therefore, that Dharmapala's pioneering ideology of Buddhist modernity is far from a simple amalgamation of Buddhism to the perceived notion of Western modernity. Rather, Dharmapala's vision became one of resistance of colonialism. Ultimately, Dharmapala's credit lies with negotiation of representations of Buddhism. He was able to align Buddha successfully with the liberal and democratic values of the West as a rebel against the Brahminical traditions. Yet it was deeply informed by Protestantism, Enlightenment rationalism, and pictorial cultural forms, as stated by Mukherjee. The all-encompassing heterogeneity of Dharmapala's revivalism is credited to the fact that modernity is itself something that is not homogeneous. It carries with it a nostalgia for the pre-modern and a hope that the ancient traditions can help in re-enchanting the world. In spite of his ideas having been published, the scholarly focus is on reinterpretation and reception of his ideas, which poses a further problem in pinpointing his ideas. In spite of the fact that Dharmapala was neither a Marx, Freud, or Horkheimer, and his influence on South Asian culture and politics were less than he had envisioned, he surely could be considered as not just a Buddhist visionary, but also a modernist ideologue. Thank you.
Thank you, Alekhya and Maitrayee.